Welcome back from lunch and to the afternoon sessions. I'm Alex Riley from the School of Law at the University of Adelaide, and I'd like to thank Helen very much for the opportunity to participate today. I last year was working on a project with Helen and Graham, and was very lucky in the second half of last year to be having regular meetings with Graham, and therefore learning from his great wealth of wisdom, because one of Graham's interests among many was the question of regulation of migration, and so that brought the law school and the Department of Geography together as well. So this afternoon we've got two panel sessions, and the first one our speakers are very familiar because we heard from them all this morning, and the panel is on what is the role of migration in the current context, 2015 and beyond. So really what we're doing is imagining migration futures in both the global and local contexts, and our speakers will speak for about 5 minutes each, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. And so the first speaker, according to the program, is Stephen. So we'll start with Stephen.
Okay. All right. Oh, yeah. It's on. Yeah, well, I mean, in a way, it seems to me fairly obvious what the role of migration is, both for Australia as a whole and especially South Australia, and that it's still a crucial source of skills, of labour, and above all of population. And I think not so much to say what the role is, because it's an important role that will continue, but I want to raise the question, which I already did earlier, really is, are we getting it right by putting skills first? And I think we need to think about migration as something that affects us as a community and as a nation. So we really need to put the significance of migration for society first before thinking about the economy. And that means really that we want to see migration as something which helps determine what type of society it is, and obviously the way that established people who have already established here, all of us are of migrant origin, of course, except Indigenous people. It really reflects on what sort of people and what sort of society we want to be. But I just would like to spell out some of the implications of that. First one I said already at length, and that is that we should think about the factors that encourage people to come to Australia, and they're not just economic factors, but much more complex than that. The second thing is we shouldn't see immigration as a substitute for having a high-quality education and vocational training system within this country. I mean, the idea of importing skills as a way of bringing resources into the country, importing human capital, I think is not the right way to look at it. I think we need to rethink multiculturalism in the context of the enormous changes taking place to the mobility of people in a global and regional context. We really need to revisit how we can maintain some of the good features of multiculturalism, but also take account of the fact that people are much more mobile than they are in the past. And finally, and I think this has been said particularly by Paul, a key issue for Australian identity is that we really need to become good international citizens again by restoring a humane refugee and asylum policy, by showing that Australia is willing to pay attention to the international legal instruments it's signed and not just ignore them. We need to pull our weight as an international citizen, and that means that in the current global refugee emergency, we should be taking a lot more people than we have in the last few years. I mean, that figure of 13,000 a year has nothing to do with our capacities. It's completely arbitrary. I see that now, even reluctantly, Mr. Abbott has come to the party on that and at least agreed to a temporary increase in intake, but we need to do that in a much more long-term basis. And I think we would need to work much more in our region This is something the Houston Committee actually recommended, and it's been completely ignored. We need to work with other countries in our region, including middle-income countries, as well as better-off countries, about having joint solutions. And of course, if we just ignore what Indonesian leaders think and just pursue a little Australia policy in what is seen as our own interests, wrongly in my view, we are not going to make ourselves very popular in the region. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Well, I think we'll just move straight on to John.
Okay. Well, my take on this issue is that there's a kind of irony that there are lots of countries around the world who, like South Australia, have got either zero or declining natural population increase. Germany's one, Japan's another. I'm sure you could name lots of others, particularly in Europe. Portugal is a standout one. And they're really worried about their economy, their workforce, the fact that they've got an ageing population that needs to be supported, and so on. And at the same time, we've got millions of people who need to escape from dreadful situations and need to relocate. And yet, whilst Germany might be putting those two things together, lots of other places don't seem to be doing that. It's actually, there's two parallel problems in the world, and we should actually look at one to help solve the other. In relation to South Australia itself, which is obviously the focus of my interest, it's very clear that the only way that South Australia is going to grow population is through attracting international migrants. If previous trends are to continue, and we have a massive, potentially massive, problem of an ageing population. The share of South Australians aged 65 increased from 15.3 to 16.7% from 2008 to 2013. And if you look at the trends, by 2036 we could have 25% of the population of South Australia aged 65 plus. That's massively top heavy and desperately needs an influx of younger working age populations, not just so that they can care for those ageing people, but also provide a taxation base from their earnings and provide the whole range of necessary economic services that are required for a successful society. So I think South Australia probably can be very selfish in its view of what the role of migration is. It's to bail us out of a massive potential future problem that the state will face. How we can attract people, I think, is an interesting argument that's been touched on in a number of ways this morning. When I was talking about infrastructure and the problems of funding infrastructure and paying for new development wherever it occurs, of course, my planner's brain says, well, it's really important that we match the development of new infrastructure and new housing to the population projections, because if we go overboard and we create an oversupply, we are actually penalising our existing population in terms of the costs, whether that's the people who are buying new houses or just the average South Australian taxpayer. But at the same time, you can spin that in a different way and consider that if we actually ended up with a mismatch between the housing stock and the population growth in the short term, and we actually develop an oversupply of housing, that's likely to either stabilise or reduce house prices. And housing affordability is one of the aces that I think we have up our sleeve as a state. Because if you look at the cost of entry to the housing market across the different Australian states, whilst I'm not suggesting that it's easy or cheap in South Australia, it's relatively easier and relatively cheaper than it is in New South Wales, Victoria, Western Australia, and so on. The late Hugh Stretton, who died very recently, wrote a fantastic book called Ideas for Australian Cities, where he talked about the policy that South Australia developed in the Playford years in the 50s and 60s. And that was predicated on attracting people to South Australia because it provided jobs and it provided cheap housing. And the South Australian Housing Trust was the mechanism that allowed that to happen. The state provided good quality, cheap housing. People came on that basis, and because the housing was cheap, the employers were able to be very competitive in the wages that they offered, and that built up an industrial base, which was really the strong point of our economy until quite recently. Now, we face the same problem now. We face exactly the same problem that Playford was addressing. How do we attract people to South Australia? What cards have we got to play? And I think we need to think about whether it's quality of life, whether it's cheap housing, whether it's job opportunities. We need to play them all in order to make sure that we continue to attract those migrants.
There's a book which has an image of a flour sack in it, and it's an image from the period of the early 20th century, which has got a picture of some grain growing, and it was the image that a number of immigrants used to describe why they came to the United States, the land of bounty, the land of openness and freedom. It was also a similar time that the Statue of Liberty was transferred from France to the United States and became the symbol of looking after people in the world. And the statement was, "Give me your huddled masses yearning to be free." Now that's the very time when we started to manage the world's population movement by setting borders, strictures, codification processes and very strong limits on that movement of people. And that's the tension we face now. The way out of that tension is not to go back to a borderless world, because the older world was not a borderless one at all. It was just one where nation states weren't asserting their dominance as the way in which passports and things were working. So if you went back to the 18th century, the first passports were introduced into France as an internal migration process. What we need now, I think, is a completely different way of understanding the movement of people. People don't move because they are just simply excited to. They move because of two reasons. One, they imagine a better world, and they imagine that the place they're coming to is going to give them something where they don't have now. And they move because of the disruption to their current place, the violence associated with it, the downturns, the economic problems they're feeling, and those sorts of things. So we're actually at a turning point, I think, in human history where both sides are now coming together for the first time. Previously, that movement was one which could be managed by national state boundaries and by turning back boats. I think we're at the point now where you cannot manage that process anymore, because even if you take the European sense of that, it means that they're now facing a world where people are scrambling across the Mediterranean and across the train lines, and the movement that's occurring, if you've been watching the various documentaries, is of return migration of people who just simply get on a truck, get caught, get sent back, who live in the fields for another 6 weeks while they're trying to get another truck to come in. And the reason why they're being caught is because they smell so bad, and therefore the officials can actually smell them now, however clever they are at concealing themselves. It's a world which is very different from the world of the Second World War, and even the world of a single place like Vietnam needing to resettle some of its people who are feeling oppressed by a new regime. Under those circumstances, I think we need a new architecture, and that architecture has to be global. It has to be global where some countries make a start, and I think Germany in the last little while has made an incredible start, and it's done so very carefully and with a managed sense of what it can handle. But it's talking about 800,000 refugees that it's going to take over the next period, and it's done so as part of a global sense and a national sense of its relationship, not just to the present, but also to its mistakes from the past, including its guest workers, the Turkish immigrants who came as short-term workers. Compare that to many situations around the world where some countries, and we've heard about some of them like the Philippines, developed, and I'll put it a bit more brutally, the Philippines developed a process of exporting young women to make money for the country. And in that process, they set up movements to the Middle East where those people became conduits for money to go back to the national economy. I think we're now in a different world, and we have to think about this, where the Australian government says, we cannot take that many people, but let's take them with humility and grace and with generosity. Let's welcome them here. Let's be part of a global situation where we engage with other countries, both regionally and globally. As Stephen was describing, it becomes a global process of dialogue about what we're going to do. And it's a similar situation to we had at the end of the Second World War. The war that had caused so many problems and needed a complete renewal process. It required a renewal of national economies, it required rethinking of relationships, and set up a global governance scheme which included World Banks and IMFs and so on. Now that hasn't been entirely successful, but it's been at least an attempt to set in the right direction. This is not against the nation state, it's actually that nation states should be stronger. Nation states should be stronger to make collective community decisions about what they want to do and take it to a national body. And it also means that local communities therefore have a relationship to that. And they will be building a place where primarily what they're building is a place for locals in a global setting. And that's why migrants will come, because really the tension we've been talking about is from South Australia, if I'm now going back to both the state level and the local level, there's a net outflow of young people. Now, that's an issue. There's something happening in the state which is more than about jobs. It's something where it needs to be addressed in terms of housing, vibrancy of social life, the nature of how you live, all those sorts of things. And that needs a discussion with those young people as well to ask them why they're leaving. And we don't actually know the answers to some of those questions yet. So if I was to then put a proposal forward, it would be for that relationship between the, the local and the global coming together in ways that means that instead of discussions which are done just through national level governments, that we have dialogue occurring across those three levels. And the state government of each of the states, I think, has a powerful place to play in that activity.
Well, thank you, Stephen, John and Paul, for those comments. So it's now open to the floor to ask any questions. Does anyone have a question straight away? Raise your hand and we'll send the roving mic around. Down the back.
G'day, my name's Mark Glasbrook. I don't think there's an issue with supply and demand when it comes to people moving to South Australia. When we look at population growth, I think it's more around federal government policy. And you look at the demands of South Australia versus the demands of other cities, and we're quite unique with what our challenges are. Yes, we've got 7.9% unemployment, but we've also got massive job shortages in agricultural and horticultural and rural communities. So if we don't have a change to immigration policy, we're never going to be able to address those shortages. There's a whole range of people that are currently unemployed, but for whatever reason they don't choose to live and move in our regions. And maybe in that there's an opportunity for looking at a semi-skilled migration program, similar to what Canada runs with their provincial program, which is a very good program, works very well. Key industry sectors where there's a genuine demand. We could certainly look at something like that here in South Australia. Primacy of Australian workers obviously comes first, but where there's genuine shortages and genuine net economic benefits that can be achieved, and where that's going to create new jobs throughout the broader economy, that could be quite a good model. And then if you have a look at how that could work with the humanitarian intake, the humanitarian intake's based on just numbers. There's, is there an opportunity to introduce a migration program within that, a skilled migration program within that, so we can accept more humanitarian entrants, but offset the social and economic costs by having people that would directly be able to work in our economy.
Okay, that was a comment, I think, more than a question. Do you want to respond?
Yep.
Any of you?
I'm happy to. Good after you. On the first issue, I think it's a really critical one, the semi-skilled migration programs. And often we hear about programs which are bringing, say, agricultural workers from the Pacific or from Melanesia and from Timor, and some people have been very passionate advocates of that. I'm in favour of many things, but the word "it depends" is what usually comes to mind. So I agree with what you're saying, but it depends. And what it depends upon is when you bring those semi-skilled migrants into agricultural regions, as it currently stands, the form that it's being talked about is mostly young men, mostly leaving Papua New Guinea or Timor or the Solomon Islands for a period of 6 months, where they develop a cash capacity. They move into a small country town where they live together and they drink a lot. They have no support, there is no training associated with it. They then go back with cash income to small villages in Melanesia or the Solomon Islands and so on, and take that cash back, and it perverts the economies of where they currently come from. So I'm absolutely in favour. In fact, it's part of what we should be thinking about. But if we, in a way, the strange thing about the global world that we've been describing is we need to get down to very much more specific policies about the social framing of each of the things we're talking about, rather than just simply saying the movement of people will be the answer to that problem. So I'm probably entirely in agreement with you, but it would be that instead of thinking about the costs as simply the economic costs of what it would be for someone's job being taken, I think we should be thinking more comprehensively. What's our relationship to the Solomon Islands or to Papua New Guinea? How can we be training people who have a relationship to us? If you take one simple example, this is a strange thing which probably everybody in this room has forgotten, and I often forget. In 1975, and this relates to a couple of other comments that were made across the course of the morning, we disenfranchised the citizenship of the whole of Papua New Guinea. That is, they were citizens of Australia until they got independence, and part of the independence was make sure they can't come here. And that process of making sure they can't come here should be reversed, but it should be very carefully reversed so that we bring a family rather than just a single young male. We bring people for specified times rather than for too long. We have training associated with it, and we have longer term relationships with towns in Papua New Guinea, which will require a town in South Australia to have a relationship with a town in Papua New Guinea to say, we will work together on this. And it won't be just a singular thing of an abstract movement of people codified as numbers. It'll be actually people, actual people who have jobs and lives and families and friends, and who make mistakes and spend their money in bad ways and good.
Okay, maybe.
I can't remember who it was, but before we were talking about the injection of young people that is required to sort of even out the upwards pyramid that we're looking at in the future. And that concept is perfect. That's exactly what we need. But I guess my question is that, you get that injection of young people who we're going to put through schooling and give training, and they're going to learn English from a young age. But for the most part, they also come with parents who are, between 30 and 50, have, for a lot of them, have experienced incredible trauma and heartbreak and have had really tough lives, often don't speak English. And so come here, and the support programs are inadequate. They might have had training in, you know, their previous lives as builders or whatever, but all of that is kind of invalid when they come here. And I'm wondering if you can think of any solutions to that problem. We're going to, you know, their children are going to grow up and able to do great things, but there's no support for the people who fall sort of in the in-between category.
Yeah, just on that, it's clear that when refugees come who've undergone traumatic experiences and have had to basically leave everything behind, they do need quite a period to find their feet again and to become more active. And I think what Graham's research showed us, particularly that paper that came out about 2007, I think it was, published by the Department of Immigration, is that it's really worthwhile to invest in the necessary services to help people find their way, whether they're young or older, because young people can be highly traumatized too if they come as refugees. It's really worth it, even in, you know, bare economic terms, because the investment in refugees always pays off in the long run. So it's short-term costs, but a long-term gain once people find their feet and get into the economy and society. So I think we have to accept there are costs initially, but in the long run it's very, very worthwhile.
Also, if I could just add to that, it's perhaps an indication of the age divide between the audience and the panel here, but young people are not just children. You're actually young, and to my mind, most of the people in this room are. If you're in your 20s and 30s, you're young. You've got a lifetime of economic activity ahead of you before you decide to hang up your gloves or your boots or whatever. So it's not just about children. You know, when I talk about the need for young people in the economy to support this top-heavy ageing pyramid, it's not just children. It's people in their 20s and 30s and even their 40s that we need in order to rebalance the population distribution.
We'll go to Helen because she's a very important person, and then we'll...
I think just to follow on that thought about sort of children and families, I just wanted to break down a bit of the family reunion visa that we have here in Australia and the way that is structured. What I didn't show on my slides that I was tempted to was that the good proportion of that is about marriage as family reunion. A very small proportion of that is about family reunion in terms of parents coming out. And the more we expect or want people to stay in Australia, the more we have to acknowledge that they are part of a bigger network than an individual or a couple or the children that they have here, that they often have parents that they need to care for. And as it was alluded to by Stephen, that for many people, that's an obligation. That is a filial obligation. It's not just about the desire to have your parents with you. Do you think we're ever going to address the issue? And just to point out, I think at the moment, the waiting list, if you're not prepared to pay to have your parent come out, is something like 16 to 30 years for you to wait for your parent to come out. If you can't afford the thousands of dollars that they expect you to pay to fast-track that, you have no hope of ever having your parents join you in this country if they're already elderly. Do you think it's time that we started to address, when we talk about migration, that we're not talking about economic individuals as a member of the labour force, but rather as a unit that belongs to a greater... It's not much of a question, more a comment.
I agree entirely. One of the things about building social life is about relationships, and quite clearly, at the moment, I think it costs $50,000 for your parents to come, and that gets you into a queue. That strange notion that we suddenly found in our world of understanding of how migrants move around the world. And $50,000 pays, and it gets you about three years, I understand, three to five. And that is a major preoccupation of people of many cultures. And what it would mean to actually change that so that you're not paying the government for something, because what you're building is a community of relations between people. And the question of paying the government as if somehow you're offsetting the costs, the other figure which is worth keeping in mind is the age 45 is the age at which, although maybe even gone up recently, that after the age of 45 it's very hard to migrate to Australia because somehow an older person is seen as much less productive and the whole thing is organised around the framework of the working life up to the age of 60, 65. And you're going to be a burden upon the community, supposedly, if you're over 45 because you've only got 15 years of a working life left to go. I think we should go back to basics again, which is around the question of how many people can we support and how best do we want our communities to work. And once you start from that position, rather than simply thinking about it as a market economy or it's a based question around the workforce, then you'll actually have people being probably, and this is Stephen's point, probably more productive because they're happier, good people. They're part of being here. Because the mobility of people is expensive. It takes up a lot of their energy. The restructuring, the resettlement means that they're often spending their time for 5 years on the very thing called resettlement. It takes an enormous amount of energy. Yeah, so if you can settle with relationships, friends and family, then you're more likely to be a person who contributes to our society in general, not just as a worker. And that includes old people.
Diane, just a comment. I think last year I did some voluntary work with unemployed people and there was an Indian man in the group. I was teaching communication skills. He was a financial planner after spending 30 years in the Indian Army as an officer. He'd come out, he and his wife had come out here because their daughter had a permanent job here. And he wanted to migrate here, and because he said it was his responsibility to organise her marriage, which is cultural. But he had 6 months. He's living on his own money. He wouldn't take any money from his daughter. And he had done all sorts to try and even get voluntary work, like driving a community bus, anything. He could not get the foot in the door anywhere. And he was about 4 months in when I met him. So he was going to have to go back to India after spending his money for 6 months, very disappointed that he and his wife would not be able to see their daughter very often. So that's just a comment on the familial thing.
Okay. Maybe people who haven't spoken, we'll come back, but down the back there was a couple of comments. Yeah.
Good afternoon. I hope this isn't too left of centre. I just wanted to build on some of the comments that were made about regionalism, with global conversations or regional joint solutions. Given that Australia basically has to concede that it can't control migration, and if it adopts an isolationist attitude, migration will continue to bottleneck in transit countries like Malaysia and the Philippines. What kind of a role can Australia or even South Australia play as a regional actor, and what would a true regional solution look like? I know we have some infrastructure and efforts like the Bali process, but it doesn't seem to have had large impact so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy to say regional solution, as I always do, but the question is, what does it actually mean? And I think the first step towards a regional solution is for Australia to stop doing the unilateral things. I mean, the push back the boats policy really angered Indonesia for good reasons, because it was disregarding Indonesian sovereignty. I mean, clearly, having people come on boats is not a good thing, but the solution is not to push the boats back, it's to have processing in the countries of origin and transit so that people then can come in safety. Now, obviously, there's a limit to what Australia can do. I think we have to accept that, it's not infinite. And what would be really important would be to work with nations within the ASEAN community to really work out what contribution other countries can make. I mean, it's really interesting to see Thailand, which has hundreds of thousands of refugees from Myanmar who are actually part of the labour force, often in a sort of semi-legal situation. But there is no recognition of the need to have a proper refugee policy. Same with Malaysia. Malaysia hasn't signed the UN Refugee Convention. There's a presence of UNHCR in Malaysia, but not a big willingness on the part of the government to discuss things. So, I mean, we really have to work through the traditional means, I guess, as a nation, of diplomacy and showing that we're prepared to do our part too, and encouraging others to do the same. There is a precedent for that. Back in the 1970s, when the Indo-Chinese refugee emergency was dominant in the region, there was a comprehensive plan of action which embraced contributions from regional countries and from the United States and Australia and France and so on. It can be done, and you know, it's a long process. It's not something one can just decree by talking about.
If I could just add something to that. We talked about definitions of refugees earlier, but one thing we didn't get to was climate refugees, which will be probably the next crisis, because there are numerous countries in this region that are going to become either uninhabitable or have large sections of their land area become more and more untenable for their populations. So you've got Pacific Island nations and relatively small populations in those, I guess, but countries like Bangladesh, which probably over the next 30 years will have about 17 million of their coastal population displaced by coastal storm surge and sea level rise, and simply loss of land. The villages that those people live on will no longer exist because the land will have disappeared. It'll have just eroded away through storm surge and river flow. I wonder whether with the upcoming Paris negotiations on climate change, it might be too ambitious, but what if we linked a country's greenhouse gas emissions to the number of refugees that it should be taking? Because I think that would boost the intake in Australia.
That's a fantastic idea, and actually accords with effectively what I've simply been arguing the whole time, that everything's connected to everything else. And in everything being connected to everything else, you need some relatively simple ways of managing those connections rather than being overwhelmed by the complexity of them, because complexity often has become the reasons for contemporary cynicism. I think Stephen's point is exactly right. We have had examples in the past where there have been collaborative multilateral responses to things. The response to the Indochina crisis, which admittedly took till 1979 to get going, but it was there, and it was something which we can actually point to as having a positive part, because it meant that the United States, and in particular was done for the wrong reason, that was the United States was concerned to show that the Vietnamese situation was one where they were supporting the anti-communists and they hated the communist government and all that sort of stuff. But what happened, and this is where good can come out of expediency, what happened during that process was that pictures were shown, and there's a lot of pictures in the archive of the State Department, the Immigration Department of the United States, which you can find online if you want to go and do some research on it, of people being picked up by boats and having their photographs taken, and the proud Navy or the connections, the people who were supporting them. There was a sense of a personal relationship to those people which was developing in that time. So to link that and to talk about what that means in relation to what John was saying, if things like climate change are going to give rise to climate change refugees, and I think Bangladesh, Vietnam, India and a number of other countries will be hard hit by this process of inundation and storm surges and so on. And we've seen major floods in Bangladesh already where millions of people were displaced, and yet that didn't have consequence on major movement. People actually want to live in the same place they grew up in. They moved and they started to go back into those places. But we need a global process, and this is linked to your question, a global process that has regional expressions. Because if we just even do a regional solution, what we find ourselves with is unable to cope with the fact that what we've been talking about, all of us, is now a global phenomenon where the movement is not actually within the regions anymore, it's actually globally. And if we go back to the 19th century, we'll find those patterns of global movement. So people forget that the great migrations of the 19th century were actually the Germans leaving to go into the world, the British going into the world, and the Chinese, which is the most forgotten of all. The Chinese, in their millions, travelled the world. The Chinese diaspora was set up during that period of the 19th century. To respond to a global situation, you need global institutions. And then those global institutions step down to regional solutions. And in those regional solutions, there's got to be some hard-headedness to it as well. Because you can't have people just simply deciding, I want to come to Australia. Because of disruption to local planning. The simple thing that John was talking about, hospital beds or planning for housing, requires time and requires universities, judgments by planners, it requires states to operate, it requires corporations to build, and so on and so on. If that's the case, then you need to have strictures and limits. And one of the limits I was proposing earlier on, which I think still works quite well, is if you arrive at a regional processing centre, or alternatively, a regional processing centre arrives where you've arrived, because there's no queue, as has been pointed out many times by many people, there is no queue. What we need is processing processes. If you arrive at one of those places and you've arrived in Indonesia, you don't know that you're going to Australia. What you know is you're leaving behind a difficult situation. And in my view, maybe it's harsh, but you might end up somewhere completely different than Indonesia, Australia or Korea, because this is a global issue and we're now trying to settle people globally, and settlement is the issue, not simply providing singular points of focus. I'll just give one story to elaborate that. There's currently a resettlement program, and this relates to your question before. There's a resettlement program for ex-battery hens. This sounds a very strange connection. But the resettlement program for ex-battery hens means that of the thousands, the millions of battery hens, and there are millions of them, a few thousands get resettled in people's backyards. And for the most part, that does nothing to change anything structurally. All it does is provide a panacea to those battery hens. What changed that situation of battery hens was people refusing to buy other than free-range eggs. And now we have the second claim where the rhetoric of care, which I was talking about before, has now come into that aspect of what now is called free-range, where you can have 10,000 chickens on 1 acre or 1 hectare. Now, that kind of world, this is the world we're now in, where we need structural and larger patterned responses rather than singular attempts by one government to stave off what is a bigger issue than all of us.
Okay, down the front and then either one. So
Yeah, could I just pick up on the idea of climate refugees, but also on the question of local versus global? You might correct me, and it's just something I've noticed in passing, but I think it's Vanuatu that has been asking for a country that could enter into an agreement with them that in the event of their island becoming uninhabitable, it may not be Vanuatu, but I think it is.
It's the Maldives, I think.
Sorry?
It's the Maldives.
The Maldives, yeah. Okay. A place where they could, so to speak, transplant to, but where there would be years of preparation for this, and where perhaps they could have some collective voice, perhaps another Australian state that would be called the Maldives state in wherever, somewhere in South Australia. Do you have any thoughts on this question?
What a fantastic question.
I think it's a fantastic idea, and I think it's one that, I mean, even if you're just looking at Australia improving its political capital in the eyes of the rest of the world, I think it would be a great thing to do. And it's not, I don't know what the population of the Maldives is, maybe one of you demographers does, but it's not enormous. It is something that could be done, and it would be a fantastic example, because clearly those people will have to go somewhere at some point. You know, it won't be a clear-cut, one day we're standing on dry land and the next day we're underwater, but why don't we address that question as if that were the scenario, and actually prepare for that very, very predictable future, and say, yes, we will do it.
I think it's extremely difficult to do that, because nation states would be very much opposed to the idea of a state within a state. I think I can't see it working personally, but I would like to put this whole climate change refugee issue in perspective, and that is that there really are very few people in the world today, probably, if any at all, who can be identified as having moved solely because of climate change. There's a great deal of research on the relationship between climate and migration, and what usually comes out of it is that when people migrate, it's from multiple factors connected with economic, social, cultural and political structures. And the empirical research does not show that this has happened that people have moved solely because of climate change. One of the interesting things that comes out of the research, and I refer particularly to a very good study commissioned by the British government's chief scientist, that people are far more likely to move into areas of environmental stress than out of them. And that is because most migration is rural-urban migration, and people move from rural areas in countries like Bangladesh or in Vietnam to the big cities, and the big cities, most of them, are just a few metres above sea level and are very vulnerable. So the problem we have at the moment is not people moving out of areas as so-called climate change refugees, but people moving into such areas. And I think the strategies, we have a whole range of strategies of prevention, adaptation, and mitigation. I won't go into detail because it would take a long time, but on the whole, the aim is to prevent large movements. I think in the future it is going to become a much more acute problem than it is at present, but we shouldn't exaggerate what's already happening.
And perhaps I can respond too. So I think the president of the Maldives, I thought, was a visionary person, and he was doing symbolic politics. So one of the things which was happening in the Maldives, like many other Pacific islands, was not sea rise was actually wiping out the land. It was rather salinisation of the water supplies, and that was making life more complicated in those places. So it fits exactly what Stephen is saying, and the complexity of people's movements is extraordinary. I also agree with Stephen in relation to setting up a Maldives within Australia. However, the part that I thought was most exciting and the visionary part of the President's view was relationships. That is, relationships are built over the long term, and they're about movement and careful, moderated building of partnerships so that as crises mount, and this crisis of climate change is already upon us, as John has said, but it's not in such a situation that somebody's going to be knee-deep in water as they have to leave their island. It's rather, even with Kiribati or those sort of places, it's mostly because the island's becoming not sustainable to live on anymore. Under those circumstances, I think the politics of setting up relationships, a bit like I was talking about before with semi-skilled migration for agricultural labour, it's about the long-term relationship one has with those people, the responsibility to care as they come into a situation, and the relationship back to them as they go back or they stay in place. So it becomes that sort of issue. I think one of the limits and one of the problems with this idea of a zone is probably emphasised by the new Zion arguments that were in the sort of modernist Zionist movements, whether Argentina or Australia. There was an idea of the Kimberley becoming the new Israel at one stage, and I'm completely against those things. But what I'm in favour of is, as you've described it, long-term relationships, building towards people being supported, where the consequences are able to be written into a framework where you can actually see what that long-term means.
Well, as I've got the microphone, I'm going to ask a question. I just got it by default actually. I'd just like your comments and on. I just sort of think we have a crisis of leadership in government actually, because just one thing that sort of I've been thinking about as I've been sitting here. I think we're getting mixed messages from the federal government. On one hand, that stop the boats, stop the boats, stop the boats, and on the other hand, we're getting, we are a compassionate nation, we will step up to the plate and do what is right for Australia, we have always done that, you know. So we are getting mixed messages, and I think, to me, as a casual observer, I just don't see that we're having a national debate on these really, really big issues, and I'd like to see that, and I'd like to know what you guys think about that.
I agree.
Well, I would just add to that something I said already, that the government has, and the opposition together really, have been trying to convince people that this, in global comparison, quite small flow of asylum seekers to Australia is a huge problem, and that has masked the much bigger changes that are taking place, for instance, with having 1 million temporary migrants in the country. We really do have a crisis of leadership, and I blame the Labour Party more than the Liberals in a way for just towing the line, and as I said earlier, this approach of Bill Shorten's of saying I'm waiting for a government briefing before he can take any sort of position. So yeah, we have a real crisis of leadership at the moment, and I mean, if we look back at our history, it hasn't always been the case. It doesn't have to stay that way.
Eric Parnas is my name. I work for Regions SA in the state government, and as a Maltese migrant to South Australia, I was also very pleased to hear some mentions of my home country earlier on. But I do have a question around the issue, I suppose, relating to government policy again. We obviously would like, for a number of reasons, our regional areas to have bigger populations to make them more sustainable in a way, and as part of that to get more migrants into regional areas of South Australia. And despite all of the visa advantages that South Australia gets, it still underperforms to a certain extent in terms of its share of migration, and the vast majority of migrants that do come to South Australia on whatever stream or class they come into tend to end up in Adelaide. So I'd be interested to know, if you're a policy maker, what would be one thing or the most important thing you would suggest to help better connect migrants with job opportunities and living opportunities in regional areas?
I think if I could just steal an idea that you came up with this morning, Paul, I think the idea of, rather than taking refugees and putting them in processing facilities, but give them somewhere to live in a small country town, preferably where you get a group of families from the same place, and really make an effort to allow them to integrate with that community, was a fantastic idea. And it would seem to be a very cost-effective one as well, if you consider the cost of the processing centres. So that would be one approach. The other critical thing, of course, is that migrants, one of the first things that they need is a job. And we need to put a lot more effort into finding ways of creating employment in regional centres in South Australia. I mean, it goes back to what I was saying this morning. We are so Adelaide-centric in this state for very good reasons, but we tend to forget what lies outside, and that it could actually offer opportunities as well as being a problem for the state.
Thank you. Forgive me if I'm a little bit long-winded in my explanation. I'm profoundly pessimistic about the future we face. We're seeing refugees, or they may be economic migrants, on the move as a flood in Europe at the present time. That's occurred basically because of political destabilisation in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria. And I suspect that there are some countries in the world that will continue with that political destabilisation. We have the problem of population increase and competition for resources occurring all around the world. We've got climate change and sea level rise, and I am terribly pessimistic on that one. For more than 20 years, the UNFCCC has been meeting and trying to get agreements, particularly from the developed world, and so far has failed. We have impending peak oil. We have financial instability and perhaps collapse, and I mean, as a good example, we could end up with about 25,000 Greeks on our shores quite legally because they're Australian citizens. So all of these things are intersecting, and I think that they're going to be coming together as a cataclysm very, very soon. Now, you may disagree with me, but I'd like you to entertain the possibility that we won't have had the discussion that we need to have, that we won't have any solutions to climate change or being even able to adapt to it. And we're going to have, just as occurring in Europe at the moment, a flood of people coming into Australia. If you were Prime Minister, how would you deal with that flood?
I was going to hand it over to them. After you. It's a huge question. I'm deeply pessimistic until I hear pessimists. And what hardens me about what you're saying is the sense of the recognition of the crisis that we face and the manifold connections. And what tends to happen, unfortunately, is exactly that all we're talking about. I think the global financial crisis was the best example of that, where it could have been a chance to make some changes to the financial architecture of how the financial system operated. It worked in such ways that we've really done some cover-up in that area and haven't done much to make changes. However, my optimism comes... Sorry, I'll actually go to my pessimism first. My pessimism comes from when somebody says, there's a technological solution to this and we'll find it somewhere, because that's exactly what's not going to happen. There's no great technology which is going to come along, and it won't be solar panels or anything like that which will give us the technical solution. Solar panels I'm absolutely in favour of course, but I know I've done a lot of work in Amsterdam working with electric vehicles, and we know electric vehicles at the moment are making Amsterdam a less sustainable city. Now, it doesn't seem self-evident. We know that Melbourne, if it had electric vehicles, would be a terrible city sustainably because its mix of electricity is so bad through brown coal. But the reason why Amsterdam is because it's bicycle riders who are buying electric vehicles. So you're getting more congestion, and we're not actually taking cars off the road, you're getting people moving into a claim. So my work, as if we had a triumvirate as they did at the start of the Whitlam period, and they said, what we're going to do about this would not be respond to that immediate question of the crisis of the movement of people, it'd be respond to the question of how are we to live. And in setting up the question of how would we live, it include questions of the informal and formal economy. It had questions, if we're just going to the livelihood question, do you know there are 97% of people are unemployed in Papua New Guinea? They still feed each other. They still, it's a hard place to live in many ways, but 97% of people are unemployed on the formal statistics. I think about 0.8% pay taxes in Papua New Guinea. It's actually possible to find 1,000 different solutions, from the informal economy of Vietnamese who came to Australia and lived in high-rise apartments in Sydney and Melbourne, who started growing vegetables, to the high-tech hydrology systems which enable us to generate water. Now, it's the combination of those things and the decisions being made across the levels from the global to the local that will make the answers to those questions work, not a singular solution or a single response to a single problem.
Yeah. I think there is one reason for optimism, and that is that at the moment humanity has more resources at its disposal, both absolutely and per capita, than ever before in history. And those resources could make our societies much more egalitarian, much more sustainable, and much better to live in. The reason for pessimism is that it's not happening, that we have political and economic systems that actually lead to greater inequality in resources, greater waste, greater pollution. And I mean, if you put it that way, the answer is obvious and at the same time extremely difficult. And the answer is political, that we have to find ways of changing those political and economic structures, which at the moment are dominant. And I think I don't know, it's difficult, this pessimism, optimism thing. I think the thing that is positive that we've seen a lot in recent times is movements for change, social movements, people doing things independently, creating new economic cooperative structures to change the economy in a small way from below. And if we're talking about migration, migration's a huge issue because there's a complete absence of global governance on the rights and protection of migrants. But there are some very interesting and important social movements among migrants, particularly in Latin America, but also to some extent in Asia and Europe. So, you know, I think one shouldn't define the world either in terms of optimism or pessimism, but say there's a struggle going on, and, you know, one can only hope that things will be resolved in a positive way.
We probably could keep talking back and forth for hours about this question because it is fundamental. I think of La Campesina as an example of exactly what Stephen is talking about, which was displaced farmers, particularly in South America, but also in other places in the world, thinking about their relationship to the land and trying to work out how they could actually be the producers of food, which goes back to an earlier question that you asked about food. So that La Campesina is actually a global movement for change, which is thinking about displacement, thinking about productivity and the relationship to property rights and sovereignty questions, for example. The other side of that is the rhetoric of care, and I think of Uber as the counterexample to that process. It's a capitalist, parasitic, large company which is actually exploiting people. And it's doing so under the rhetoric of care as if you've got the freedom to exploit yourself as a car driver. And so we do have these problems at the moment where it's very difficult to take these things and unravel them. And I think it's the fact of having conversations and forcing onto the agenda the kinds of conversations we're having today, which enables people to untangle those particular differences.
Can I add something from the chair? Because I think it's a fabulous question. And I think it's all in our minds, the lack of progress. My point of optimism would be that ultimately all of us are human and have reasonably similar human values. And I think the example of the Turkish boy dead on the beach is an extraordinary one. Within a week, we are taking 12,000 more refugees. And that was just... That was a politician, government at that level, actually very quickly being able to talk through the cabinet process and say, right, we are doing this. So I think once that human element it gets into the heart of our leaders and they are really having serious talks, it's surprising it hasn't happened yet, but I think it will. And when it does, the response is going to be very quick on many levels.
I just add, I think there are grounds for optimism. I often, probably after several glasses of wine, would sound just like you. But
you can do it without the wine.
But you can do it without the wine. But at the same time, that statistic I gave you about Germany and its renewables, the promise that we have in South Australia and the whole of Australia to shift towards a non-fossil economy. That's happened very, very quickly, much more quickly than I thought it would happen. And I've been looking at these issues for probably a 30, 35-year academic career. There's often a point that you reach where informed people understand the problem, they've got suggestions as to potential policies, and they're incredibly frustrated that the politicians don't seem to get it. And then fast forward a decade or maybe 15 years, and suddenly it's all changed, it's all happened. There's always a lag between the understanding of the problem and the formulation of potential solutions and the politicians buying into it. But I think it is a particularly bleak view that you've presented, and whilst I'm not saying that I always disagree with it, a bit like Paul, when I hear the pessimists, I turn into an optimist. I don't think, the world has faced enormous crises before, and it's come out of them. A lot of people suffer on the way, undoubtedly, but we're all still here.
This is just a plea. There's a strange coalition, and you mentioned Germany, so I'll put this in. Berlin, in a coalition with Johannesburg and Buenos Aires, has developed a climate change adaptation charter. The City of Adelaide could sign on to that very easily.
Okay, well, I think we've probably got time for one more question, and then we'll wind up the session.
Hi, my name's Megs, and just as a side note, I just want to let you know that we're very welcoming here in South Australia. So much so that Adelaide City Council is a refugee welcome zone, and they hosted a welcome picnic earlier this year for refugees. So my question, probably more so to you, Paul, is currently we're taking in 12,000 Syrian refugees. How many do you think we really could take?
That would take an enormous amount of research and an enormous amount of work to find out. I'd actually go about it the other way. I'd go and make a claim in the way that, say, Gareth Evans did for Cambodia, or the way Malcolm Fraser did in relation to Indochina, or the way I'd take it to a national assembly to then get an agreement to take it global and become a country which leads the way in arguing for a global response to this. And I think Stephen put it most eloquently. There is actually no global governance in relation to migration, including humanitarian migration. There is only a High Commissioner who can put out statistics and can make claims about principles, but there's no governance as such. I would go, having given Australia to that, and say we will abide by whatever is globally decided under circumstances where that is seriously addressing these issues with a cooperative response from enough countries to make a difference. And then the numbers would come out of that process rather than us unilaterally saying 15 or 20 or 50, because 50 is nothing. 50,000 people would have actually been nothing under the circumstances. I said 2 million are currently in Lebanon. There's also another million in Jordan. And Jordan is built upon refugees and migrants. It's a country full of them. The whole region is full of migrants, refugees and people who are no longer called displaced persons because they've been living in the same place and their children have been born in their place and their children's children have been born in that place. Are they unsettled? Well, of course they are, but they're no longer part of the statistics. So it's that kind. I'd go a different way. I'd start from a different place.
I guess my question probably is more an opinion, because earlier you said 12,000 is not enough, and I definitely agree with that. So how much do you think I agree with what you're saying from a statistical analysis point of view, no doubt, but in your opinion, how much further could we go? Because I think there's a lot we could do as a nation to advocate for how much we think we can take.
Personally, I'd reverse the process of skilled migration and humanitarian immigration. I'd just reverse it. Yeah. And what you'd find out is actually that you are still supporting highly skilled people.
Yeah, and that's my experience. I get to work with have a lot of friends that are asylum seekers and refugees, and they're very highly skilled. Thank you.
All right, and that might be a good discussion point over afternoon tea as well. So can I ask you to once again thank our speakers, Paul, John and Stephen.